The evergreen branches creaked under an unexpected weight as Kaelor Vynreth adjusted the rope with the same careful precision he had once used to hang Christmas ornaments. Each twist of hemp sending a different kind of message across the Alabama cotton fields on this December morning in 1852. In just 3 hours, when the Carrowe family gathered for their traditional holiday celebration, they would discover that their grand Christmas tree had been transformed into something far more permanent than seasonal decoration. This is the story of how one enslaved man turned a symbol of joy and family tradition into an instrument of calculated justice, leaving his master suspended among the tinsel and candlelight. The massive pine tree stood in the center parlor of Thornwick Plantation, its branches adorned with ribbons and glass baubles that caught the firelight like tears. But tonight, those same sturdy limbs would bear witness to a reckoning 15 years in the making, when years of patient observation finally culminated in one perfect moment of retribution. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The scent of pine needles mixed with the metallic tang of hemp rope as Kaelor Vynreth positioned the final ornament on what would become Carrowe's hanging tree. December frost painted the windows of Thornwick Plantation's grand parlor, while inside, candlelight danced across tinsel that would soon reflect something far more sinister than holiday cheer. By dawn on Christmas morning 1852, the Carrowe family would discover that their beloved patriarch had become the centerpiece of their own festive display. Thornwick Plantation sprawled across the red clay hills of central Alabama like a monument to human bondage disguised as Southern hospitality. The main house rose 3 stories above rolling cotton fields, its white columns gleaming in the winter moonlight like ivory tusks extracted from some massive beast. Spanish moss draped the ancient oaks that lined the carriage drive, creating shadows that moved like phantoms across manicured lawns where no enslaved foot was permitted to tread except in service to white comfort. The parlor dominated the mansion's ground floor, a cavernous space designed to display wealth accumulated through human suffering. Persian rugs imported from distant lands covered polished hardwood floors that enslaved hands had installed and maintained. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings painted with cherubs and angels, their innocent faces blind to the moral darkness that pervaded the rooms below. Oil paintings of previous Carrowe generations gazed down from gilded frames, their eyes following visitors with the same predatory intensity that characterized their living descendants. At the room's center stood the Christmas tree, a magnificent 15-foot pine that had required 6 enslaved men to transport from the nearby forest. Its branches spread wide enough to shelter a congregation, decorated with imported glass ornaments that cost more than most people earned in a year. Ribbons of gold and crimson silk wound through the needles like veins carrying the lifeblood of opulence. Beneath its boughs, wrapped packages awaited the Carrowe offspring. Gifts, purchased with profits extracted from human misery, but presented as tokens of familial love. The tree had stood in this same spot for 12 consecutive Christmases, a tradition that Carrowe maintained with religious devotion. Every December, he personally supervised its installation, ensuring that each ornament hung in precisely the correct position. He took particular pride in the star atop the highest branch, a creation of pure silver that he claimed symbolized the divine blessing upon his household. What he didn't realize was that for the past 3 years, Kaelor had been studying that tree with the intensity of an architect, learning its structure and weight distribution with plans that extended far beyond seasonal decoration. Carrowe possessed the particular combination of cruelty and self-righteousness that made slavery profitable in antebellum Alabama. At 45, he had inherited Thornwick from his father along with the Methodist convictions that justified owning human beings and the business acumen that made it lucrative. He ruled his domain with biblical authority, quoting scripture to defend practices that violated every principle of human dignity. His library contained works by prominent theologians who argued that slavery was God's design for racial harmony, texts that he read aloud during evening devotionals, attended by his wife and 3 teenage offspring. Lunara Carrowe complemented her husband's brutality with refined efficiency, managing the household enslaved workers with the same attention to detail she applied to flower arrangements. She scheduled whippings between tea parties, calculated food rations during charity committee meetings, and planned slave auctions around social events that required her presence in town. Her correspondence with other plantation wives contained detailed discussions of discipline techniques interspersed with recipes for holiday treats and gossip about neighboring families. The Carrowe offspring had learned to regard enslaved people as animated furniture, useful for specific purposes but lacking any intrinsic worth beyond their utility. They grew up believing that black skin indicated divine curse, that servitude was the natural condition of African descendants, and that kindness toward enslaved workers represented weakness that undermined proper social order. Their education included lessons in plantation management alongside traditional subjects, preparing them to inherit and perpetuate the system that sustained their comfortable existence. What none of the Carrowe family understood was that Kaelor Vynreth possessed intelligence that surpassed their own, hidden beneath layers of performed submission that had taken years to perfect. At 32, he had spent 15 years at Thornwick, purchased as a teenager from a Virginia plantation where his ability to read had marked him as dangerous. The Carrowes believed they had broken that dangerous intelligence through careful application of punishment and psychological manipulation. They congratulated themselves on transforming a potentially rebellious enslaved person into a model of docility and obedience. But Kaelor had never been broken, only bent into shapes that appeared harmless while concealing depths that would have terrified his owners if they possessed the insight to perceive them. He had learned to speak in the simplified dialect that white people expected, to move with the shuffling gait that suggested mental limitation, to keep his eyes downcast in the manner of someone who had accepted his inferior status. The performance required constant vigilance, every gesture calculated to reinforce white assumptions about black intellectual capacity. During those 15 years, Kaelor had accumulated knowledge the way other people collected coins, storing information about Carrowe family routines, business dealings, personal weaknesses, and moral hypocrisies. He knew which theological arguments Fendrel used to justify particular cruelties, which social pressures influenced Lunara's household decisions, and which psychological vulnerabilities affected each family member. Knowledge represented the only currency that enslaved people could accumulate without suspicion, the only weapon that couldn't be confiscated during the periodic searches that violated their few remaining privacy boundaries. The Christmas tree had become central to Kaelor's long-term planning 3 years earlier when he first observed its installation process. He noticed how the massive trunk required careful bracing to support the weight of decorations, how the parlor's high ceiling provided ample space for suspension, and how the holiday schedule created predictable patterns in family behavior that could be exploited by someone patient enough to wait for the perfect opportunity. Most importantly, he recognized the profound symbolic power of transforming a celebration of birth into a memorial for death. The irony appealed to his sense of poetic justice. Fendrel Carrowe proclaimed Christian values while practicing systematic dehumanization, celebrating the birth of a Savior who had preached love and mercy while inflicting suffering that would have appalled biblical prophets. The Christmas tree represented everything hypocritical about Southern Christianity, a pagan symbol adopted by people who claimed moral authority while violating fundamental principles of human brotherhood. Using that same tree as an instrument of retribution would expose the spiritual bankruptcy that had always lurked beneath Thornwick's pristine exterior. Tonight, as December wind rattled shutters and scattered the last autumn leaves across frozen ground, Kaelor prepared to transform years of careful observation into decisive action. The Christmas tree stood ready, its branches strong enough to support more than ornaments, its position perfect for the grim purpose he had envisioned. Tomorrow morning would bring either justice or his own destruction, but either outcome represented an improvement over the endless degradation that defined enslaved existence. The clock in the main hall chimed 11 times, marking another hour in the countdown toward a reckoning that had been 15 years in the making. The Alabama winter of 1852 wrapped Thornwick Plantation in deceptive tranquility, frost silvering the cotton fields where enslaved hands had recently completed another harvest that enriched the Carrowe family while impoverishing human souls. The plantation encompassed nearly 2,000 acres of prime agricultural land, worked by 68 enslaved people who lived in quarters hidden behind the main house like a shameful secret that everyone acknowledged but no one discussed. Slave Row consisted of 20 crude cabins constructed from rough pine boards, each housing multiple families in conditions that wouldn't have been considered adequate for livestock. The quarters buzzed with subdued activity even in winter's depths, as enslaved people maintained the endless cycle of labor that sustained white comfort. Women mended clothing by candlelight, their fingers working until they bled to repair garments that would be discarded by white families without thought. Men crafted tools and furniture that would bear no mark of their skilled craftsmanship, their artistry attributed to white overseers who couldn't distinguish a chisel from a hammer. Elderly enslaved people shared stories and wisdom in whispered voices, passing down survival strategies disguised as folklore to grandchildren who would need every advantage to navigate the treacherous landscape of bondage. The main house stood in stark contrast to the quarters, a monument to wealth extracted from human suffering and displayed without shame or self-awareness. Its architectural grandeur spoke of European influences filtered through Southern sensibilities, with Greek Revival columns supporting galleries that provided shade during Alabama's brutal summers. The interior featured imported marble, hand-carved millwork, and furnishings that cost more than entire enslaved families. Every luxury had been purchased with profits from cotton production, every comfort enabled by the systematic exploitation of human beings who received no compensation beyond survival rations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thornwick's location in central Alabama placed it at the heart of the Cotton Kingdom, surrounded by similar plantations that formed an interconnected network of wealth and oppression. The nearby town of Millbrook served as a commercial hub where cotton was sold, enslaved people were bought and auctioned, and plantation families conducted business while maintaining the social rituals that legitimized their participation in human bondage. Church services, social gatherings, and political meetings reinforced the ideological framework that portrayed slavery as beneficial for all involved, a divinely sanctioned system that elevated white people while providing guidance and purpose for supposedly inferior beings. The winter season brought unique challenges and opportunities for enslaved communities. Reduced agricultural demands meant more time for clandestine activities, but also increased scrutiny from owners who had fewer distractions from supervision duties. Holiday preparations required additional labor, as enslaved people decorated mansions, prepared elaborate feasts, and served as living props in celebrations of white family togetherness. The irony was profound. People denied their own families were forced to facilitate white domestic happiness, creating joy for others while experiencing none themselves. Christmas held particular significance in the enslaved community, representing both spiritual hope and cruel mockery. Many found genuine comfort in the story of divine incarnation, interpreting the birth narrative as promise of eventual liberation from earthly suffering. Others struggled with the cognitive dissonance of celebrating a religion that had been used to justify their enslavement, finding it difficult to reconcile teachings about universal love with daily experiences of systematic hatred. Some rejected Christianity entirely, maintaining African spiritual traditions in secret while performing Christian observance to avoid punishment. The Carrowe family's Christmas traditions reflected the broader contradictions of Southern culture, combining genuine religious sentiment with practices that violated fundamental Christian principles. They attended church services where ministers preached about divine love, while blessing an economic system based on human exploitation. They read biblical passages about liberation while holding people in bondage, sang hymns about divine justice while participating in systematic injustice, and celebrated the birth of someone who had championed the oppressed while oppressing others themselves. Fendrell Carrow's personal theology represented a masterpiece of self-serving interpretation, allowing him to maintain Christian identity while practicing systematic cruelty. He had convinced himself that slavery benefited enslaved people by providing them with civilization, religion, and purpose they supposedly couldn't achieve independently. His library contained numerous works by theologians who had developed elaborate biblical justifications for human bondage, creating intellectual frameworks that allowed Christians to participate in slavery without experiencing cognitive dissonance. The plantation's physical layout reinforced social hierarchies through architectural symbolism, with the main house elevated both literally and figuratively above the quarters. Wide lawns separated white domestic space from enslaved living areas, creating psychological distance that made it easier for plantation families to ignore the humanity of their workers. The arrangement also served practical purposes, allowing overseers to monitor enslaved activities while maintaining the illusion that slavery was somehow less coercive than other forms of forced labor. Winter nights at Thornwick carried sounds that told the story of two communities existing in the same physical space but inhabiting completely different worlds. From the main house came laughter, music, and conversation, as the Carrowe family enjoyed leisure activities made possible by enslaved labor. From the quarters came softer sounds, hushed conversations, muffled weeping, occasional singing that expressed both sorrow and hope in melodies that predated their arrival in America. Sometimes the two soundscapes intersected when enslaved people were summoned to provide entertainment or service, creating jarring juxtapositions that highlighted the moral absurdity of the entire system. The December cold affected enslaved and free people differently, with white families retreating to heated parlors while enslaved people struggled to maintain warmth in poorly constructed cabins. The Carrowes possessed multiple fireplaces, imported wool clothing, and adequate nutrition to sustain body heat during Alabama's brief but penetrating winter season. Enslaved people huddled together for warmth, wore threadbare clothing that provided minimal protection, and received reduced rations that weakened their ability to generate internal heat. These disparities weren't accidental oversight, but deliberate policies designed to maintain dependency and prevent enslaved people from accumulating resources that might facilitate escape attempts. The Christmas tree itself represented the pinnacle of white domestic luxury, a tradition imported from German culture and adapted to Southern sensibilities. Its presence in the Carrowe parlors symbolized the family's connection to broader American cultural trends, while simultaneously highlighting their isolation from moral progress occurring in other regions. The decorations told stories of international commerce made possible by slavery: silk ribbons from Asia, glass ornaments from Europe, silver ornaments crafted by northern artisans who pretended not to know how southern customers had acquired their purchasing power. Tonight, as frost painted intricate patterns on windows and candlelight flickered through rooms that had witnessed unspeakable conversations about human commodity prices, Thornwick Plantation balanced on the edge of transformation. The familiar rhythms of oppression would soon be disrupted by actions that had been years in planning, thoughts that had been decades in formation, and justice that had been centuries in delay. Kaelor Vynreth moved through Thornwick Plantation's morning routines with the measured precision of someone whose survival depended on appearing predictable while concealing depths that would have shattered white assumptions about enslaved intelligence. At 32, he possessed the lean build of someone who had performed physical labor since adolescence, his hands bearing scars from cotton thorns and workshop accidents that told the story of enforced productivity without compensation. His face had learned to display only the emotions that white people expected to see: deference, gratitude, and the particular kind of cheerful submission that plantation families interpreted as evidence of successful domestication. But behind eyes that had been trained to avoid direct contact with white authority lay an intellect that had been sharpened rather than dulled by 15 years of systematic oppression. Kaelor had discovered early in his enslavement that intelligence was a liability that could prove fatal if detected, so he had learned to hide his capabilities beneath performances so convincing that even other enslaved people sometimes questioned whether his apparent simplicity was genuine. The deception required constant vigilance, every word measured to suggest mental limitations while conveying necessary information, every gesture calculated to reinforce expectations while achieving practical objectives. His journey to Thornwick had begun in Virginia, where he had been born to Erisa Dornell, an enslaved woman whose master had recognized her exceptional intelligence and briefly attempted to provide formal education before realizing that literate enslaved people posed threats to the social order. Erisa had taught her son to read using discarded newspapers and torn pages from books, conducting lessons in secret while instilling in him both love of learning and understanding that knowledge could be more dangerous than ignorance in a world determined to maintain black intellectual submission. When Kaelor was 17, his ability to read had been discovered during a routine search of enslaved quarters, leading to brutal punishment and immediate sale to prevent his influence from spreading to other enslaved people on the Virginia plantation. The trauma of separation from his mother had been compounded by transportation to Alabama in chains, packed into wagons with other human beings who were being relocated to satisfy white economic calculations that treated people as interchangeable units of production. Carrowe had purchased Kaelor specifically because of his literacy, not despite it. The plantation required someone capable of maintaining detailed records of cotton production, slave health, and equipment inventory, tasks that demanded skills beyond those possessed by most overseers. But Carrowe believed he could harness Kaelor's intelligence while preventing it from becoming subversive, using combination of rewards and punishments to create loyalty based on calculated self-interest rather than genuine affection. The strategy had appeared successful for 15 years, with Kaelor demonstrating exceptional competence in assigned duties while showing no signs of the rebellious tendencies that white people associated with educated enslaved people. He maintained careful records, supervised other enslaved workers with apparent efficiency, and displayed the kind of grateful submission that allowed plantation owners to believe their slaves appreciated the guidance and structure that bondage provided. His performance was so convincing that the Carrowe family had begun to regard him as proof that slavery could elevate deserving individuals while maintaining necessary social hierarchies. What they didn't understand was that Kaelor's compliance masked years of careful observation and strategic planning that had transformed him from victim into potential agent of justice. Every interaction with the Carrowe family had been analyzed for useful information, every conversation overheard and cataloged for future reference, every routine memorized and evaluated for potential exploitation. He had learned Fendrell's business dealings by maintaining plantation records, understood family dynamics by observing daily interactions, and identified individual vulnerabilities by paying attention to conversations that white people conducted in his presence because they assumed he lacked the intelligence to comprehend their significance. His position as record-keeper had provided access to information that revealed the full scope of Thornwick's operations and connections to the broader slavery network. He knew which banks financed cotton purchases, which merchants handled slave sales, which politicians received donations in exchange for favorable legislation, and which ministers provided theological justification for human bondage. The knowledge painted a comprehensive picture of systemic complicity that extended far beyond individual plantation boundaries, encompassing an entire regional economy built on human exploitation. Kaelor had also learned about the Carrowe family's personal secrets through years of invisible observation. He knew about Fendrell's gambling debts, Lunara's correspondence with previous suitors, and the ways that financial pressures influenced plantation management decisions. He understood how social expectations shaped family behavior, which relationships generated tension, and how individual fears affected responses to unexpected situations. The information represented a detailed psychological map that could be used to predict and manipulate white reactions during moments of crisis. His literacy had allowed him to access books in the Carrowe library during cleaning duties, expanding his knowledge of history, philosophy, and religion in ways that provided context for his experience of enslavement. He had read accounts of successful revolts, studied strategies employed by other oppressed groups, and developed understanding of legal and political systems that might be exploited by someone clever enough to navigate their complexities. The reading had also exposed him to abolitionist arguments that provided intellectual framework for resistance, while confirming that slavery was neither natural nor inevitable. Most importantly, Kaelor had used his intelligence to study other enslaved people at Thornwick, learning their stories, understanding their capabilities, and identifying potential allies for future resistance activities. He knew which individuals possessed specialized skills, which had experienced particular traumas that might motivate desperate action, and which maintained spiritual beliefs that could sustain them through periods of extreme danger. The information had allowed him to build networks of mutual support while maintaining operational security that protected everyone involved. The Christmas tree had become central to his planning 3 years earlier when he first recognized its potential as both practical tool and powerful symbol. The tree's size and positioning made it suitable for purposes beyond seasonal decoration, while its significance in Carrowe family traditions ensured that any disruption would generate maximum psychological impact. He had spent subsequent Christmases studying the installation process, measuring dimensions, testing branch strength, and calculating weight distribution with the methodical precision of an engineer designing critical infrastructure. His plan required perfect timing, flawless execution, an ironclad alibi that would deflect suspicion while achieving justice that legal systems would never provide. The strategy combined practical elements learned through years of observation, with symbolic considerations that would transform individual act of resistance into broader statement about enslaved humanity and white moral bankruptcy. Tonight would determine whether 15 years of careful preparation had created opportunity for successful retribution or merely elaborate method of committing suicide. As evening approached and the Carrowe family gathered for their traditional Christmas Eve celebration, Kaelor completed his final preparations with hands that remained steady despite the magnitude of what he was planning to accomplish before dawn. The crack of the whip echoed across Thornwick's frost-covered yard like thunder announcing an approaching storm, followed by screams that would haunt Kaelor's dreams for the 3 days remaining before his carefully planned retribution reached its culmination. Zarina Claveth, barely 14 years old, writhed against the whipping post, while 29 other enslaved people were forced to watch Fendrel Carrowe demonstrate the consequences of challenging white authority through the simple act of learning to write her own name. The December morning had begun with deceptive normalcies as enslaved people completed their assigned tasks in preparation for the Carrowe family's Christmas celebrations. Zarina had been scrubbing floors in the main house when Lunara Carrowe discovered a piece of paper hidden beneath the young woman's mattress during one of the periodic searches designed to prevent enslaved people from accumulating unauthorized possessions. The paper contained Zarina's name written in careful letters, evidence of literacy that violated one of Thornwick's most fundamental rules. Fendrel had been summoned immediately, his face darkening with rage that seemed disproportionate to the apparent simplicity of the offense. But literacy represented more than education to plantation owners. It symbolized independence, communication capability, and access to information that could undermine the psychological control upon which slavery depended. An enslaved person who could read might learn about abolitionist activities, communicate with potential allies, or develop ideas about rights and dignity that conflicted with their assigned status as human property. The trial, if it could be called that, had lasted less than 10 minutes. Zarina was dragged before the assembled enslaved community and accused of violating plantation rules through unauthorized learning. When asked where she had acquired writing materials, she remained silent, understanding that any answer would implicate others in activities that were considered subversive. Her silence was interpreted as defiance, adding to her crimes and ensuring that the punishment would serve as an example that would discourage similar activities among other enslaved people. Kaelor had watched the proceedings with apparent dispassion, while his mind calculated how this moment would serve his larger purposes. He had been the one who taught Zarina to write, conducting secret lessons in the barn during evening hours, when other enslaved people gathered for what appeared to be social activities but actually constituted clandestine education sessions. The irony was profound. He was witnessing punishment for activities that he had encouraged, watching someone else suffer for knowledge that he had provided. But Zarina's whipping represented more than individual tragedy. It exemplified the systematic brutality that characterized everyday life for enslaved people, and provided final motivation for actions that Kaelor had been contemplating for years. The sight of a young woman being tortured for the crime of literacy crystallized his understanding that reform was impossible within a system designed to dehumanize, and that justice could only be achieved through measures that white society would label as criminal, but that represented the only available response to crimes far more serious than anything he was planning to commit. Fendrel's voice carried across the plantation yard as he explained the theological and practical justifications for punishment, citing biblical passages that supposedly sanctioned slavery while emphasizing the importance of maintaining discipline among enslaved workers. His performance was directed as much toward the white overseer and his own family members as toward the enslaved audience, demonstrating his commitment to principles that he claimed were essential for social stability. The speech revealed the psychological gymnastics required to maintain Christian identity while practicing systematic cruelty. "Learning belongs to those God has placed in authority," Fendrel proclaimed, his words creating white clouds in the cold air. "When the inferior seeks to elevate itself beyond divine intention, correction becomes necessary for the good of all concerned. This punishment protects our entire community from the chaos that results when natural order is disrupted through prideful ambition." The 20 lashes were administered with methodical precision, each stroke designed to inflict maximum pain while avoiding permanent damage that would reduce Zarina's economic value. The overseer wielded the whip with practiced skill, spacing the blows to prevent excessive bleeding while ensuring that the psychological impact would last far longer than physical healing required. Other enslaved people were forced to watch, their faces carefully controlled to display appropriate concern without suggesting sympathy that might be interpreted as support for subversive activities. Kaelor maintained the expression of sorrowful disapproval that white people expected from loyal enslaved workers witnessing punishment of less disciplined individuals. But beneath his mask of submission, rage burned with intensity that threatened to overwhelm the self-control he had cultivated through 15 years of performance. The sight of Zarina's blood mixing with frost on the whipping post crystallized years of accumulated anger into determination that could no longer be contained through passive resistance or strategic compliance. The punishment concluded with warnings directed toward all assembled enslaved people about the consequences of similar infractions. Fendrell emphasized that literacy threatened not only plantation security but the broader social order that protected everyone from chaos and violence. He claimed that education would make enslaved people dissatisfied with their divinely appointed status, creating unrest that would ultimately harm both white and black communities. The arguments revealed profound fear beneath aggressive confidence, suggesting that plantation owners understood the subversive potential of knowledge even while claiming to act from benevolent concern. As other enslaved people dispersed to their assigned tasks, Kaelor approached Zarina with apparent intention of providing comfort that would reinforce his reputation for loyalty and compassion. But his quiet words carried different meaning than what observing white people might have expected. Justice comes in its own time, and time moves differently for those who understand patience. The message was intended for Zarina, but also for himself, confirming that the moment for action had finally arrived. The afternoon brought additional provocations as the Carrowe family prepared for their Christmas celebration with obvious enjoyment that contrasted sharply with the morning's brutality. They discussed presents, planned menu items, and debated seating arrangements with cheerful absorption that suggested complete emotional disconnection from the suffering they had inflicted hours earlier. Their ability to transition seamlessly from administering punishment to celebrating family togetherness revealed moral compartmentalization that made them capable of extraordinary cruelty without experiencing corresponding psychological distress. Evening preparations required Kaelor's supervision as enslaved people decorated the main house according to Lunara's precise specifications. The Christmas tree received particular attention, with each ornament positioned to create maximum visual impact when candles were lit for the family's traditional Christmas Eve gathering. Kaelor directed the work with apparent dedication while conducting final reconnaissance of the parlor's layout, confirming measurements and testing structural elements that would be crucial for his plan's success. As darkness settled over Thornwick and the enslaved community returned to their quarters, Kaelor began implementing preparations that had been years in development. The time for patience had ended, replaced by commitment to actions that would either bring justice or death, but would certainly end the intolerable status quo that had defined his existence since arriving in Alabama 15 years earlier. Tonight would determine whether Zarina's suffering had been the final injustice he would witness passively, or the catalyst that transformed him from observer into agent of retribution. The moon hung like a silver dollar against the December sky as Kaelor Vynreth made his final preparations in the plantation's toolshed, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent months perfecting every detail of what would unfold in the next 6 hours. The shed stood 50 yards from the main house, close enough to observe the parlor windows but far enough to conduct activities without detection by the occasional patrol that Fendrell Carrowe maintained during winter months, when reduced agricultural work allowed enslaved people more time for potentially subversive activities. Inside the cramped wooden structure, surrounded by implements designed for farming but equally suited for more violent purposes, Kaelor reviewed the mental map he had constructed through 3 years of careful observation and planning. Every aspect of tomorrow's events had been considered from multiple angles, contingencies developed for various scenarios, timing calculated to exploit the predictable rhythms of Carrowe family Christmas traditions. The plan represented a masterpiece of strategic thinking disguised as the simple preparations of a loyal enslaved worker fulfilling his assigned duties. The Christmas tree itself had been the starting point for all subsequent planning, its massive size and central position in the parlor making it both practical tool and powerful symbol for what Kaelor intended to accomplish. At 15 feet tall, with a trunk nearly 18 inches in diameter, the pine possessed structural integrity, capable of supporting far more weight than the glass ornaments and silk ribbons currently adorning its branches. The tree's placement in the exact center of the room provided clear sight lines from multiple directions, while offering sufficient space for activities that required careful positioning and precise timing. Kaelor had conducted extensive reconnaissance during the 3 previous Christmas seasons, observing the tree installation process with apparent casual interest, while actually analyzing weight distribution, anchor points, and the mechanical principles that governed its stability. He had learned that the massive trunk was secured in a custom iron stand that weighed nearly 40 pounds when filled with water, creating a foundation stable enough to prevent toppling under normal circumstances, but potentially vulnerable to deliberate manipulation by someone who understood its limitations. More importantly, he had discovered that the parlor's high ceiling and exposed beam construction created opportunities for creative application of rope and pulley systems that could transform seasonal decoration into something far more permanent. The beams ran parallel to the room's long axis at a height of approximately 20 feet, supported by posts that were integrated into the mansion's original construction, and therefore capable of bearing significant additional weight without structural compromise. The rope itself had been acquired gradually over several months, through careful management of plantation inventory records that Kaelor maintained as part of his official duties. Hemp rope was essential for various agricultural activities, from securing loads in wagons to creating temporary enclosures for livestock, which meant that moderate quantities could be diverted without creating suspicious shortages. Kaelor had collected approximately 60 feet of 3/4-inch rope through systematic underreporting of usage, storing the excess in various locations around the plantation where discovery was unlikely. His study of knot-tying techniques had been conducted under the pretense of improving his effectiveness in assigned tasks that required securing various objects during transport or storage. The reality was that he had mastered several sophisticated knots, specifically designed for situations where rapid deployment and absolute reliability were essential factors. The bowline, running bowline, and sliding knots had been practiced until muscle memory made their creation automatic even in darkness or under extreme stress. The mechanical advantage provided by improvised pulley systems had been calculated with mathematical precision that would have impressed engineering professors at institutions that excluded people who looked like Kaelor from enrollment. Using a combination of fixed and movable pulleys created from materials available in the plantation's workshop, he could multiply his effective strength by factors sufficient to lift and position weights that would normally require multiple people to handle safely. Timing represented the most critical element of the entire operation, requiring precise coordination with Carrowe family Christmas traditions that had remained consistent for more than a decade. Fendel's evening routine during holidays followed patterns so predictable that they could be scheduled like clockwork, beginning with brandy consumption in his study while reviewing plantation records and financial documents. The alcohol served multiple purposes in Kaelor's planning, both slowing Fendel's reflexes and providing justification for any erratic behavior that might be observed by other family members. Christmas Eve held particular significance in the Carrowe household, with traditions that extended from early evening through midnight services at the local Methodist church. The family gathered in the parlor for gift exchange, carol singing, and readings from religious texts that emphasized themes of divine love and human brotherhood, while remaining carefully silent about the implications of those teachings for their treatment of enslaved people. The hypocrisy was so profound that it had become invisible to participants who had learned to compartmentalize moral instruction from daily practice. Fendel's personal Christmas Eve routine included a final inspection of the house and grounds around 11:30. Ostensibly to ensure security but actually to indulge his obsessive need for control over every aspect of plantation operations. The inspection followed a predetermined route that began in the main house parlor, where he would admire the Christmas tree and reflect on another year of prosperity achieved through systematic exploitation of human beings. This moment of solitary contemplation would provide the opportunity that Kaelor had been planning to exploit. The alibi required for survival after tomorrow's events had been constructed with equal attention to detail, based on careful study of how investigations typically proceeded when enslaved people were suspected of crimes against white authority. Kaelor understood that his literacy and apparent intelligence made him an obvious suspect for any sophisticated crime committed on the plantation, which meant that his performance during questioning would need to be flawless to deflect suspicion toward other potential perpetrators. The key insight was that white investigators expected enslaved criminals to be either impulsively violent or crudely calculating, lacking the intellectual sophistication necessary for elaborate planning or the psychological control required for convincing deception. By appearing too simple-minded to conceive such a complex scheme while simultaneously providing information that directed suspicion toward more plausible suspects, Kaelor could position himself as a cooperative witness rather than a dangerous perpetrator. Several enslaved people at Thornwick possessed characteristics that made them more likely suspects than Kaelor in the minds of white investigators. Sylvan Maurice, a field hand who had been caught attempting escape 2 years earlier, represented the kind of obviously rebellious individual that whites expected to commit violent crimes. His public resentment of plantation discipline and his documented history of defiance made him a convenient scapegoat for any act of resistance that required explanation. Similarly, old Kaelor Vynreth possessed knowledge of plantation operations gained through 40 years of enslavement at Thornwick, making her a plausible candidate for planning elaborate revenge schemes. Her advanced age provided both motive, through decades of accumulated grievances, and opportunity, through intimate familiarity with Carrowe family routines and household vulnerabilities. White investigators would find it easier to believe that an elderly enslaved woman had finally snapped under the pressure of lifelong oppression than to accept that someone like Kaelor had hidden revolutionary capabilities beneath years of apparent loyalty. The psychological profile that Kaelor intended to present during inevitable questioning emphasized childlike confusion rather than sophisticated understanding, humble gratitude rather than resentful anger, and simple faith rather than complex reasoning about justice and morality. The performance would draw upon stereotypes that white people used to justify slavery by portraying enslaved people as mentally and emotionally inferior beings who required guidance and protection from supposedly superior white authority. But beneath this carefully constructed mask, Kaelor had spent months preparing mentally for the physical and emotional demands of implementing his plan. The act of deliberately ending another human being's life required psychological preparation that went far beyond technical planning, forcing him to confront fundamental questions about violence, justice, and the moral compromises required for resistance against systematic oppression. The decision to proceed had not been reached lightly or quickly, but through gradual recognition that legal remedies were non-existent, that reform was impossible within the current system, and that passive resistance had failed to prevent ongoing atrocities like Zarina's whipping. The choice was between accepting permanent victimization or becoming something that his moral education had taught him to regard as wrong, even when applied to people who deserved punishment for their crimes against human dignity. Religious considerations had required particular attention, given that Kaelor maintained genuine Christian faith despite his rejection of the theological justifications used to support slavery. He had studied biblical accounts of violence committed by righteous individuals against oppressors, finding precedent for actions that violated general commandments but served larger purposes of justice and liberation. The examples of Moses killing the Egyptian taskmaster and David slaying Goliath provided frameworks for understanding righteous violence as distinct from murder motivated by personal gain or malicious hatred. The symbolic dimensions of using the Christmas tree for his purposes had been carefully considered for their potential impact on both white and enslaved communities. For white people, the desecration of their most cherished family tradition would serve as profound psychological assault, forcing them to confront the reality that their comfort and security depended upon the acquiescence of people they had systematically brutalized. The message would be clear. Enslaved people possessed both the intelligence and determination necessary to strike at the heart of white domestic life. For enslaved people, the transformation of a symbol of white celebration into an instrument of justice would demonstrate that resistance was possible even under the most controlled circumstances, that apparent powerlessness could be converted into decisive action through careful planning and patient execution. The Christmas tree would become a reminder that no oppressor was truly safe from the consequences of their actions, regardless of how thoroughly they believed they had broken the spirits of their victims. As midnight approached and the Carrowe family concluded their Christmas Eve celebrations with the traditional reading from Luke's Gospel about divine love incarnated in human form, Kaelor completed his final preparations with hands that remained steady despite the magnitude of what he was preparing to accomplish. Tomorrow morning would bring either justice or his own destruction, but either outcome represented an improvement over the endless degradation that defined enslaved existence. The tools were ready, the plan was perfected, and the moment for action had finally arrived after 15 years of patient preparation. In 6 hours, the Carrowe family Christmas tree would become a monument to the proposition that human dignity could not be destroyed, only temporarily obscured by systems that would eventually face reckoning from those they had tried to reduce to property. Justice would arrive with the dawn, delivered by hands that had been trained to serve but had chosen instead to strike back against oppression in the only language that white supremacy seemed capable of understanding. The grandfather clock in the Carrowe mansion's main hall chimed 11:30 as Kaelor Vynreth moved through shadows that seemed to welcome his presence like old friends who had been waiting years for this moment of reckoning. The December night wrapped Thornwick Plantation in crystalline silence, broken only by the distant howling of winter wind through bare oak branches and the occasional creak of settling timber in buildings that had witnessed decades of human suffering disguised as Christian civilization. Inside the main house, the Carrowe family had concluded their Christmas Eve celebration with traditional readings and prayers before retiring to their respective chambers, leaving the parlor empty except for the Christmas tree that would soon fulfill a purpose far different from seasonal decoration. Kaelor entered the mansion through the kitchen entrance, using keys that his position as record-keeper had legitimately provided, but applying them now for activities that would have horrified their original grantors. The kitchen retained warmth from evening meal preparation, creating a pocket of comfort that contrasted sharply with the cold resolution that had settled over his mind during the final hours of preparation. Every step across familiar floorboards was calculated to avoid the subtle sounds that might alert light sleepers to unauthorized movement, his bare feet finding the spots where experience had taught him the wood would bear weight without protest. The hallway leading to the parlor stretched before him like a corridor through time, lined with portraits of previous Carrowe generations who gazed down with expressions of satisfied superiority that would soon be transformed into witnesses to the destruction of everything their legacy represented. The paintings depicted men and women who had built their fortunes through systematic exploitation of human beings, their faces bearing the particular combination of self-righteousness and casual cruelty that characterized people who had convinced themselves that their prosperity was evidence of divine blessing rather than moral bankruptcy. Moonlight streaming through tall windows created patterns of light and shadow that seemed to shift and dance as Kaelor approached the parlor, where the Christmas tree stood in magnificent isolation like a monument to white domestic happiness built upon foundations of black suffering. The tree's ornaments caught and reflected the pale illumination, creating tiny points of brilliance that would soon be overshadowed by darkness of a different kind. Glass baubles imported from European workshops told stories of international commerce made possible by American slavery, while silk ribbons spoke of luxury purchased with profits extracted from human misery. The rope lay coiled against his body like a serpent awaiting its moment to strike, 60 feet of carefully selected hemp that had been tested for strength and flexibility during months of clandestine preparation. Each strand had been examined for flaws that might compromise its integrity under stress, the entire length inspected with the thoroughness of someone whose life would depend upon its performance during the next hour. The weight distribution and tensile strength had been calculated with mathematical precision that would have impressed engineers at institutions that denied admission to people who shared his skin color. Kaelor began his work with the methodical efficiency of someone who had rehearsed every movement countless times in imagination, transforming the Christmas tree from symbol of celebration into instrument of justice, through application of principles learned during 15 years of careful observation. The first step involved securing anchor points in the exposed ceiling beams, using knots that would distribute weight evenly while providing the mechanical advantage necessary to lift and position loads that exceeded his individual physical capabilities. The bowline knots were tied with muscle memory that functioned independently of conscious thought, fingers moving in patterns that had been practiced until they became automatic responses to specific situations. Each loop was formed with precise measurements that would ensure optimal performance under the stresses that would soon be applied, the rope positioned to avoid contact with beam edges that might cause fraying or failure at critical moments. The mathematics of load distribution required careful attention to angles and anchor spacing, creating a support system capable of handling forces that would test every component to its designed limits. The second phase involved creating the mechanism that would transform seasonal decoration into permanent installation, using the Christmas tree itself as both anchor point and display stand for what would become Thornwick Plantation's most memorable holiday presentation. The tree's substantial trunk provided stability that could support additional weight beyond its current burden of ornaments and tinsel, while its central position in the parlor ensured maximum visibility for the message that Kaelor intended to deliver through his actions. The running noose was constructed with particular attention to the sliding characteristics that would ensure rapid tightening under load while maintaining enough flexibility to accommodate the precise positioning required for his purposes. The knot represented a masterpiece of engineering disguised as simple rope work, designed to function flawlessly under conditions where failure would mean discovery and certain death for someone whose only crime was refusing to accept permanent victimization. Every twist and loop had been calculated to provide specific performance characteristics that would achieve intended results without creating unnecessary suffering or prolonged struggle. As midnight approached, Kaelor heard the familiar sounds of Carrowe beginning his traditional Christmas Eve security inspection, footsteps moving through the mansion with predictable timing that had been observed and catalogued during years of apparent subservience. The sounds grew closer as Fendrel completed his review of upper floors and began descending toward the parlor, where his final stop would bring him within reach of justice that had been 15 years in the making. Each footfall echoed through corridors like a countdown toward reckoning that would transform both victim and perpetrator in ways that neither had anticipated when this evening began. The parlor door opened with the barely audible whisper of well-oiled hinges, admitting the man whose casual cruelty had shaped Kaelor's existence since his arrival at Thornwick as a 17-year-old torn from his mother's arms and sold like livestock to satisfy white economic calculations. Fendrel entered with the confident stride of someone who had never questioned his right to own other human beings, his movements reflecting the particular combination of entitlement and obliviousness that characterized people who had been born into privilege built upon others' suffering. Fendrel approached the Christmas tree with apparent intention of conducting his usual admiring examination of the decorations, unaware that the ornaments now included additions that would make this inspection his final act as master of Thornwick Plantation. The brandy consumed during his earlier study session had slowed his reflexes while intensifying the self-satisfied contentment that made him vulnerable to someone who had been planning this moment with predatory patience. His breathing was audible in the silence, creating rhythm that would soon be interrupted by sounds of an entirely different character. Kaelor remained motionless in shadows cast by furniture that had been arranged to provide concealment during the critical moments when surprise would determine whether his plan succeeded or failed catastrophically. The positioning had been calculated to allow rapid movement while maintaining invisibility until the moment when action became irreversible, creating optimal conditions for someone whose survival depended upon perfect execution of movements that had been rehearsed in imagination countless times during the preceding months. The transformation from observer to actor occurred with fluidity that surprised even Kaelor, years of suppressed rage channeling themselves into movements that possessed grace and precision despite their violent purpose. The rope seemed to move of its own accord as he stepped from concealment, forming the intended configuration with efficiency that reflected perfect coordination between conscious intention and unconscious preparation. Fendrel's startled gasp was cut short before it could develop into a cry for help, surprise, and alcohol combining to slow his responses below the speed required for effective resistance. The physical struggle was brief but intense, testing the strength and determination that Kaelor had been accumulating throughout 15 years of systematic oppression disguised as Christian guardianship. Fendrel's soft body, unaccustomed to anything more strenuous than walking between plantation buildings, proved inadequate against someone who had been hardened by decades of forced labor and motivated by grievances that transcended individual revenge to encompass broader questions of justice and human dignity. The outcome was predetermined by years of preparation meeting moment of opportunity. As Fendrel's struggles weakened and then ceased, Kaelor felt emotions that he had not anticipated during his months of planning. Rather than satisfaction or triumph, he experienced profound emptiness where he had expected to find fulfillment, as if the act of taking life had diminished rather than enhanced his own humanity. The reality of ending another person's existence carried weight that no amount of intellectual preparation could have made bearable, forcing him to confront the moral costs of choosing violence as response to systematic violence. But there was no time for philosophical reflection during moments when discovery would mean immediate death for someone whose only protection was the appearance of innocence that he had spent years cultivating. The final phase of his plan required positioning the body in a manner that would create maximum psychological impact, while providing minimum evidence that might lead investigators toward the truth about what had actually occurred in the parlor during the hours before Christmas morning. The Christmas tree became both gallows and monument, its festive decorations creating surreal contrast with the grim reality of what now hung among the tinsel and glass ornaments. The image would burn itself into the memory of everyone who witnessed it, transforming symbol of white domestic happiness into reminder that no oppressor was truly safe from the consequences of their actions. The message was clear. Enslaved people possessed both intelligence and determination necessary to strike at the heart of white supremacy when pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. Kaelor's final task involved removing all evidence of his presence, while ensuring that the scene would be discovered at the optimal time for maximum impact on the Carrowe family and broader plantation community. The rope work was concealed among tree branches in a manner that would appear to support theories of suicide, while actually representing something far more subversive. Every detail was arranged to deflect suspicion while delivering a message that would resonate throughout the region's slave-owning community. As he prepared to leave the parlor, Kaelor paused for a final look at the Christmas tree that had been transformed from symbol of celebration into monument to resistance. The sight would remain with him for whatever time remained in his life, serving as a reminder that justice sometimes required becoming something that civilization taught people to regard as monstrous, even when applied to monsters who had created the conditions that made such transformations necessary. The walk back to the slave quarters required different movements than his earlier approach, every step now carrying the weight of actions that could never be undone and knowledge that would forever separate him from the person he had been before this night. The transformation was complete, victim had become agent of retribution, and Christmas morning would bring either vindication or destruction, but certainly would end the intolerable status quo that had defined his existence for 15 years. Dawn arrived at Thornwick Plantation with deceptive serenity, winter sunlight painting frost-covered cotton fields in shades of gold and amber that belied the darkness that had descended upon the main house during the hours when most of Alabama slept in peaceful ignorance of the revolution that had occurred in a single parlor. The December morning carried the crisp clarity that followed cold nights, with air so pure it seemed to magnify every sound and sharpen every detail into focus that would burn itself permanently into memory. But beneath this surface tranquility lay currents of change that would transform not only Thornwick but the broader community's understanding of the relationships between oppressor and oppressed. Kaelor had returned to the slave quarters before 3 a.m, slipping into his narrow bunk with movements calculated to suggest uninterrupted sleep, rather than return from activities that would have resulted in immediate execution if discovered. The performance required suppressing every natural response to the magnitude of what he had accomplished, forcing his breathing into regular patterns while his mind raced through implications and contingencies that would determine whether he survived the coming investigation. Sleep had been impossible, despite physical exhaustion, adrenaline, and hypervigilance combining to keep him alert for sounds that might indicate discovery or suspicion. Around him, the enslaved community maintained the rhythms of forced rest that provided inadequate recovery from days of unpaid labor, but represented the only respite available from systematic exploitation. Their breathing created a collective soundtrack of survival, punctuated by occasional murmurs or movements that spoke of dreams where freedom was possible, and dignity was recognized as inherent rather than conditionally granted by white authority. None of them suspected that their world had fundamentally changed during the night, that the power dynamics governing their existence had been challenged in ways that would reverberate far beyond Thornwick's boundaries. The discovery would come at 7:15 when Talise Corvain, assigned to light the parlor fires and prepare the room for the family's Christmas morning celebration, entered to find a scene that transformed holiday tradition into something that would haunt her dreams for decades. Her screams shattered the morning calm like crystal against stone, carrying across the plantation grounds with intensity that conveyed horror beyond ordinary human experience. The sound brought people running from every direction, enslaved and free alike converging on the main house to confront evidence that their carefully ordered world had been subjected to forces that none of them had imagined possible. Talisa stood frozen in the parlor doorway, her hand pressed against her mouth as if trying to contain sounds that had already escaped, her eyes wide with shock that rendered her temporarily incapable of coherent speech. Behind her, other household workers gathered with expressions that cycled through confusion, disbelief, and dawning recognition of what hung among the Christmas tree ornaments like some grotesque addition to the seasonal display. The sight defied immediate comprehension, requiring several moments for minds to process the reality of what they were witnessing. Carrowe's body swayed gently in the morning breeze created by the open door, suspended from the Christmas tree's sturdy branches, with ropework that spoke of careful planning rather than impulsive violence. His face bore the particular expression of someone who had died in surprise and terror, eyes bulging with recognition that his authority meant nothing to gravity or justice. The contrast between his lifeless form and the cheerful decorations surrounding it created cognitive dissonance that would affect everyone who witnessed it, transforming symbol of celebration into reminder of mortality and moral reckoning. The ornaments continued to catch and reflect morning light with cheerful indifference to the grim addition to their display, glass baubles and silk ribbons maintaining their festive appearance despite the shadow cast by the body that hung among them. The star atop the tree seemed to preside over the scene with symbolic authority that mocked Fendral's previous claims to divine blessing, suggesting that higher powers might have different perspectives on justice than those promoted by plantation theology. Carrowe's arrival in the parlor triggered reactions that confirmed the psychological impact that Kaelor had intended to achieve through his choice of method and location. Her initial scream gave way to hysterical sobbing that alternated with denials of what her eyes were clearly showing her, as if rejecting visual evidence might somehow undo the reality that her husband's body decorated their Christmas tree like some macabre ornament crafted by supernatural forces beyond human understanding. The children's reactions varied according to their ages and previous exposure to mortality, but all displayed the particular trauma that results from having fundamental assumptions about safety and order violated in the most intimate domestic space. The youngest daughter fainted immediately upon seeing her father's corpse, while the older sons stood paralyzed between horror and fascination, unable to process how their patriarch had been transformed from figure of absolute authority into testament to the limitations of human power. Word of the discovery spread across the plantation through communication networks that operated faster than any official channels, carrying news that would fundamentally alter relationships between enslaved and free people throughout the region. The enslaved community learned of Fendral's death through whispered conversations that conveyed basic facts while avoiding speculation that might prove dangerous if overheard by white authority. Their reactions were carefully controlled to display appropriate shock and concern, rather than satisfaction that might be interpreted as evidence of complicity in activities that white people would label as murder. But beneath their masks of submission, many felt emotions that they had never expected to experience: hope that resistance was possible, pride that someone had found courage to act against oppression, and fear that collective punishment might follow individual action. The news represented both inspiration and danger, demonstrating that enslaved people possessed capabilities that white society refused to acknowledge, while also creating risks that could affect everyone associated with Thornwick Plantation. Kaelor's performance during these crucial early hours required precise calibration between appearing appropriately shocked while avoiding the excessive reactions that might indicate prior knowledge of events. He joined other enslaved workers who gathered near the main house to await instructions from white authority figures, who were struggling to comprehend what had occurred on their supposedly secure plantation. His facial expression reflected bewilderment and concern that seemed genuine because it was genuine, though not for the reasons that observers might assume. The genuine elements of his reaction stemmed from recognition that he had crossed lines that could never be uncrossed, transforming himself from victim into someone whose actions would be remembered long after his death. The weight of taking another human life carried psychological costs that no amount of intellectual preparation could have made bearable, forcing him to confront questions about justice and morality that had previously existed only in theoretical frameworks. Sheriff Tobias Blackwood arrived within 2 hours of the discovery, his horse lathered from hard riding across county roads that remained treacherous from recent ice storms. He was a methodical man who approached investigations with systematic thoroughness that had earned him reputation for solving crimes that other lawmen found too complex or politically sensitive. His examination of the parlor scene would determine whether this case was classified as suicide, murder, or some combination that defied conventional categories. The initial assessment suggested possibilities that ranged from self-inflicted death motivated by financial or personal pressures to elaborate homicide committed by someone with intimate knowledge of plantation operations and family routines. The rope work displayed sophistication that indicated either extensive preparation by the victim himself or careful planning by perpetrator who possessed mechanical knowledge and access to materials that narrowed the suspect pool considerably. Blackwood's methodology involved cataloging every detail of the scene before forming theories about what might have occurred, understanding that initial impressions often proved misleading when subjected to rigorous analysis. He photographed the body's position from multiple angles, measured rope lengths and knot configurations, and examined the Christmas tree's condition for evidence of struggle or unusual stress that might indicate external forces had been applied to create the final arrangement. The parlor itself showed no signs of violent struggle beyond the obvious outcome, with furniture remaining in normal positions and decorative objects undisturbed except for those directly affected by the hanging process. This absence of disruption suggested either that death had occurred without significant resistance, or that evidence of struggle had been carefully removed by someone knowledgeable about investigative procedures. Preliminary examination of the body revealed details that complicated simple explanations while raising questions about the victim's state of mind and physical condition during his final moments. Rope burns on the neck indicated the death had resulted from strangulation rather than broken neck, suggesting either deliberate choice of method or circumstances that prevented more rapid termination of life. The positioning of hands and arms showed defensive wounds consistent with attempts to remove the noose, contradicting theories of willing self-destruction. Most disturbing to investigators was evidence that suggested the victim had been rendered unconscious before being suspended from the tree, indicating level of planning and mechanical knowledge that exceeded what they expected from typical plantation crimes. The implications pointed toward perpetrator, who possessed both intellectual sophistication and intimate familiarity with the victim's routines, characteristics that narrowed the suspect pool while raising uncomfortable questions about plantation security and enslaved people's actual capabilities. Dr. Marcus Ashworth's medical examination would provide additional details that further complicated initial theories while establishing timeline and cause of death with scientific precision that left little room for alternative interpretations. His findings would either support or contradict witness testimony while revealing forensic evidence that might identify the perpetrator or confirm theories about self-inflicted death. As morning progressed and news of Fendrell Carrowe's death spread throughout the county, Thornwick Plantation became focal point for discussions about slave rebellion, plantation security, and the fundamental assumptions that governed relationships between white authority and black resistance. The Christmas tree hanging would be remembered as a moment when comfortable illusions about enslaved docility were shattered by evidence that oppressed people possessed both intelligence and determination necessary to challenge systems that claimed absolute power over their lives. The investigation was about to begin in earnest, and Kaelor prepared for the performance that would determine whether he lived to see another Christmas or joined his former master in death. The greatest test of his intelligence and self-control lay ahead, requiring him to convince trained investigators that he lacked the capabilities necessary to plan and execute the crime that had transformed Thornwick's Christmas celebration into something that would be remembered throughout Alabama for generations to come. Every answer would need to be carefully calculated to deflect suspicion while appearing spontaneous, every gesture designed to reinforce assumptions about enslaved intellectual limitations while providing information that directed attention toward other potential suspects. The next phase would test everything he had learned about white psychology and investigative procedures during 15 years of careful observation. Sheriff Tobias Blackwood's investigation began with methodical precision that reflected years of experience unraveling crimes that others had dismissed as unsolvable, his weathered hands recording details in a leather-bound notebook, while his sharp eyes cataloged inconsistencies that might reveal the truth beneath carefully constructed facades. The parlor had been cordoned off from curious observers, creating a sacred space where evidence would be gathered and analyzed according to scientific principles that represented the latest advances in criminal investigation. Every rope fiber, every displaced ornament, every scuff mark on polished floors would be examined for clues that might identify the person responsible for transforming Thornwick's Christmas celebration into a scene that would haunt witnesses for the remainder of their lives. The initial examination revealed complexities that immediately eliminated simple explanations while raising questions about the intellectual capabilities required to plan and execute such an elaborate crime. The rope work displayed sophisticated understanding of mechanical principles, with knots that had been tied according to specifications that maximized efficiency while minimizing the possibility of failure under stress. The positioning of the body suggested knowledge of human anatomy and weight distribution that exceeded what most people possessed, indicating either extensive preparation by someone with relevant experience or assistance from multiple individuals working in coordination. Most troubling to investigators was evidence that the victim had been rendered unconscious before being suspended from the Christmas tree, contradicting theories of suicide while demonstrating planning that required intimate knowledge of plantation routines and family schedules. The timing had been calculated to ensure discovery at maximum emotional impact, with the body positioned to create psychological trauma that extended far beyond simple homicide. The symbolism was unmistakable. Someone had deliberately chosen to desecrate the most sacred elements of white domestic life, a statement about power relationships that governed plantation society. Dr. Marcus Ashworth's forensic examination provided additional details that further complicated the investigation while establishing a timeline that narrowed the window during which the crime could have been committed. The victim had died between midnight and 2 in the morning, during hours when most plantation residents were asleep and surveillance was minimal. The cause of death was strangulation rather than broken neck, indicating either deliberate choice of method or circumstances that prevented more rapid termination of life. Defensive wounds on hands and arms showed that Vynreth had attempted to remove the noose, contradicting theories of willing participation in his own demise. But the most significant discovery emerged from careful analysis of rope fibers and knot configurations that revealed techniques associated with maritime traditions rather than agricultural applications commonly known on plantations. The perpetrator possessed specialized knowledge that suggested either previous experience with sailing vessels or instruction from someone familiar with naval practices. This finding immediately expanded the scope of investigation beyond Thornwick's boundaries, while raising questions about the backgrounds and capabilities of individuals who might have access to such information. Sheriff Blackwood's interview strategy involved separating potential suspects according to their perceived likelihood of possessing the intelligence and opportunity necessary to commit such a sophisticated crime. The process began with interrogation of white family members and overseers, individuals whose social status protected them from the harsh treatment typically applied to enslaved suspects, but whose access to the victim and knowledge of plantation operations made them potentially viable perpetrators. These preliminary interviews would establish alibis while providing baseline information against which subsequent testimony could be evaluated. Lunara Carrowe's emotional state precluded effective questioning during the first 24 hours following discovery, her grief manifesting in hysteria that alternated between denial and accusations directed toward various members of the enslaved community. Her initial statements focused on Sylvan Morrichet, the field hand whose previous escape attempt had marked him as potentially dangerous in the minds of white authority. She insisted that his resentment over harsh punishment had motivated revenge against the family that had shown him Christian mercy by allowing him to remain at Thornwick rather than selling him to more brutal plantation operations. The Carrowe offspring provided alibis for each other while displaying trauma responses that seemed genuine rather than calculated performances designed to deflect suspicion. Their shock appeared authentic, though investigators recognized that family loyalty might motivate protective lies if evidence emerged, suggesting involvement by household members. The children's testimony emphasized recent changes in their father's behavior, particularly increased drinking and expressions of concern about financial pressures that had affected plantation operations during the previous growing season. James Whitmore, the plantation overseer, presented himself as a competent professional whose relationship with Vynreth had been based on mutual respect and shared commitment to maintaining discipline among enslaved workers. His alibi was solid, verified by his wife and several neighbors who had observed him at home throughout the evening in question. But his testimony revealed tensions within the enslaved community that might have motivated violent resistance, particularly resentment following Zarina Clavith's recent punishment for unauthorized literacy activities. The focus gradually shifted toward enslaved suspects, as investigators concluded that white family members lacked both motive and opportunity for such an elaborate crime. This transition marked a fundamental change in interrogation methods, with procedures becoming increasingly coercive as authorities applied pressure designed to extract confessions from individuals whose legal protections were minimal and whose testimony would be automatically discredited if it conflicted with white interests. Kaelor's first formal interview occurred on December 27th, conducted in the plantation's toolshed under conditions deliberately chosen to create atmosphere of intimidation and isolation. Sheriff Blackwood had arranged lighting to create harsh shadows while positioning himself to loom over the subject, psychological techniques designed to break down resistance and encourage truthful responses from individuals accustomed to submitting to white authority. The setting sent clear messages about power relationships, while providing privacy for interrogation methods that might prove necessary if initial approaches failed to produce desired results. "You maintain plantation records," Blackwood began, consulting notes that summarized Kaelor's responsibilities and background. "That means you're familiar with rope usage, inventory management, and family schedules. You had access to materials and knowledge necessary for this crime." The accusation was presented as established fact rather than speculation, forcing Kaelor to respond defensively while providing information that might reveal inconsistencies in his carefully constructed persona. Kaelor's response emerged in the hesitant dialect that white people expected from enslaved workers, each word chosen to suggest limited intellectual capacity while providing sufficient information to satisfy immediate questions. "Yes, sir, I keeps records like Master Fendrel taught me. But I don't know nothing about ropes except what's needed for farm work. Master Fendrel was good to me, gave me important work when others might have put me in the fields. Why would I want to hurt him?" The performance required delicate calibration between appearing cooperative while avoiding responses that might demonstrate the sophisticated thinking capabilities that would mark him as a dangerous individual capable of planning elaborate crimes. Too much ignorance would seem artificial, while too much intelligence would contradict the image of simple-minded loyalty that had protected him for 15 years. The balance was crucial, requiring him to appear helpful while actually providing no useful information to advance the investigation. Sheriff Blackwood pressed for details about access to materials and knowledge of family routines, questions designed to establish opportunity while testing the consistency of responses under pressure. The rope used in this crime came from plantation inventory. As record keeper, you would know about any missing supplies. You would also know about Mr. Carrowe's evening habits, his security inspections, the timing that would be necessary for this kind of operation. Each question required careful consideration of multiple factors. How much knowledge could he admit to possessing without appearing suspicious? Which details would demonstrate helpful cooperation versus dangerous competence? And how to direct attention toward other potential suspects without seeming manipulative. The responses had to appear spontaneous, while actually representing calculated moves in a psychological chess game where failure meant death. "I keeps track of what comes and goes, but rope gets used for lots of things around here," Kaelor replied, maintaining eye contact patterns that suggested respect without challenge. "Field hands borrow it for fixing fences, moving equipment, lots of reasons. If some went missing, could have been anybody who took it. As for Master Fendrel's habits, most everyone knew he made rounds at night. Wasn't no secret about that." The investigation's focus on rope knowledge led Blackwood to question other enslaved individuals about maritime experience or contact with people who possessed sailing backgrounds. This line of inquiry eventually revealed that Orlise Branvel, an elderly woman who worked in the main house laundry, had been purchased years earlier from a Charleston plantation where she had worked near the harbor district and observed ship operations. Her testimony provided investigators with a potential source for the specialized knot-tying techniques, while directing suspicion away from Kaelor's own capabilities. But Blackwood's instincts suggested that the crime required more than technical knowledge, demanding psychological sophistication and strategic thinking that exceeded what he expected from most enslaved individuals. His questions became increasingly probing as he searched for evidence of intelligence that might indicate capacity for elaborate planning. This wasn't just a killing, it was a message. Someone wanted to make a statement about power, about challenging the natural order. That kind of thinking requires education, ideas about rights and justice that enslaved people aren't supposed to possess. The accusation contained dangerous implications that Kaelor needed to deflect without appearing evasive or defensive. His response required demonstrating the kind of simple faith that white people preferred to find among their enslaved workers, religious beliefs that emphasized acceptance and submission rather than justice and resistance. "Sheriff, sir, I learned what the Bible teaches about accepting what God provides. Master Fendrel always said that questioning our place in the world leads to trouble, and I believe that. Whoever did this terrible thing must have gotten confused about right and wrong." The answer served multiple purposes, reinforcing his image as a loyal, religiously minded individual while subtly directing blame towards someone with different theological perspectives, possibly someone influenced by dangerous ideas about equality or justice, that contradicted plantation orthodoxy. The response suggested that he understood proper social relationships, while lacking the rebellious impulses that might motivate violent resistance. As interrogations continued over several days, Kaelor maintained his performance despite increasing pressure designed to break down psychological defenses and reveal hidden knowledge or capabilities. Other enslaved individuals were subjected to similar treatment, with investigators applying various techniques to extract confessions or information that might identify the perpetrator. The process created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that affected the entire plantation community, while failing to produce evidence that satisfied Sheriff Blackwood's growing certainty that someone was successfully deceiving him. The investigation was approaching a critical phase where continued failure to identify suspects would force authorities to consider possibilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about enslaved people's intellectual capabilities and organizational potential. The Christmas tree hanging had demonstrated planning and execution skills that exceeded what white society believed possible from individuals they had systematically denied education and opportunity. The implications threatened comfortable myths about racial superiority, while raising uncomfortable questions about plantation security and the actual thoughts harbored by people who had been forced to appear content with systematic oppression. Kaelor recognized that his survival depended on maintaining his performance despite escalating pressure, while ensuring that investigators found alternative explanations that satisfied their need for closure without exposing the truth about what had actually occurred in the parlor on Christmas Eve. The next phase would test his ability to deflect suspicion while appearing cooperative, helpful, and intellectually incapable of the crime that had transformed Thornwick Plantation from symbol of white supremacy into reminder that oppressed people possessed capabilities that their oppressors neither recognized nor understood. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.